Okay, well, welcome to this last ESCoE webinar of the year. I'm going to hear from two speakers today. First of all, from Francesca Foliano. She's a Senior Research Fellow at UCL and soon to be joining the Economics Department at the University of Southampton. And she'll speak on her work on spatial differences in social mobility in England. And I think you'll speak for about 40 minutes, Francesca, and then we'll hear from Xiaowei Xu, who is a senior research economist at IFS, who will discuss the paper, and we'll then have a little bit of time for Q&A, and you can type your questions into the Q&A box, please. I should also mention that both of our speakers today are fellows of ADR UK, which is short for Administrative Data Research UK, which is a significant ESRC investment promoting research use of linked admin data held by government departments, and without whom the type of work that Xiaowei and Francesca are engaged in would not be possible. So over to you, Francesca.
Okay, thank you very much, Rebecca, for the introduction. Just a second, I'm going to share my slides. Can you see my slides now?
No, I can't see them.
No? I'll try again. Okay, I'll try the...
There they are.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for having me here today. I will present some results from a joint project with my colleagues at the Institute for Fiscal Studies in UCL, Pedro Carneiro, Sonia Krutikova, Julia Law, and Lindsay McMillan. This research we are carrying out focuses on understanding spatial differences in social mobility in England. So we're gonna look at social mobility across different areas in England separately for men and women, because we are also interested in understanding whether there are differences in social mobility between men and women. As Rebecca said, I would like to mention that from my side, this research has been funded by the ADR UK. As you would see in this research, we will use administrative data, the longitudinal educational outcomes data set that the ADR UK has been making an effort to make more available to researchers in England. Okay, so as I said, we're going to study spatial differences in social mobility in England. Why is this interested as a topic in general, in particular for the UK? Previous research, mostly based on survey data and birth cohort studies, has shown that social mobility has worsened across cohorts over time, and more specifically, the UK performs poorly internationally. That is, the UK has a stronger correlation between childhood circumstances and later life outcomes when compared to other Western and developed countries. However, this is a blunt picture that hides quite a lot of heterogeneity across areas and heterogeneity across different groups of the population. As I mentioned in this paper, we will focus on comparing men and women, but other papers have started to look at differences across ethnicities and areas as well in the UK. Okay, so this is why it's interesting to look at social mobility for the UK, but there is a very important factor that we need to consider. The fact that until recently it was very difficult to look at subnational studies. It was very difficult to implement subnational studies of social mobilities, looking at different areas or different groups because of the lack of big samples. We could only rely on survey data. More recently, we started to have access to more administrative data, and particularly advances in administrative data linkages have given researchers the possibility to look at social mobility at a subnational level across geographical areas, again, and across groups. So why this is interesting in general to look at different areas? Well, it's interesting because understanding which areas perform better or worse and what are the factors that are correlated to areas performing better or worse can help design better policies that can target these differences in social mobility and kind of level up these disparities in mobility across the UK. I'm generally talking about the UK, but as you will see, my study focuses on England because data available at the moment to me are for England. Okay. So given this introduction, I'll say that these are our research questions. As I already mentioned, we look at how social mobility vary across different areas in England. We look at how special differences in social, if there are special differences in social mobility between men and women. And then we also start to look at some sort of link between geographical mobility and spatial mobility. Why is that? Because our focus will be young adults, and young adults in England are highly geographically mobile. But also there is a positive selection into this residential mobility, usually wealthier individuals and across the distribution of parental income, individuals with more ability to earn are the ones more likely to move away from the areas where they grew up. And therefore, these may have consequences for our understanding of social mobility. For this reason, we will also compare how estimates of social mobility for only stayers, that is individuals who are observed later on in life in the same areas where they were observed, where they were growing up, compared to social mobility measures obtained using the full sample of individuals in the local authority when they were observed there at the age 16. Finally, we look at, in a very descriptive and qualitative, but also descriptive way, the main factors associated with social mobility at the local level. Okay, so these are our research questions, and I'm going to give a very quick summary of the paper, also because I have quite a lot of results. I'm going to give a summary of the results as well, just in case I don't manage to get to the end. So what we do in this paper, we use administrative data for 3 cohorts of young adults that were born between 1985 and 1987. As I said before, we are interested in looking at social mobility across areas, and our geographical units of interest in this study will be upper tier local authorities, which are around 150, and we assign individuals to these local authorities according to where they were observed at age 16, where they were living at age 16 when they were in school. One thing to mention straight away is that usually studies on social mobilities try to understand the correlation between childhood circumstances and child later outcomes in life, usually earnings. And usually for childhood circumstances, researchers use parental income. However, at the moment, administrative data in England do not provide a linkage between young adults' earnings and their parents' earnings for when the young adults were younger. There's no link at all, actually, between parents and children. Therefore, we had to build a measure of disadvantage that is based on the level of deprivation of the neighborhood of residence at age 16. So we will use characteristics of the neighborhood. I'll talk a little bit more about it to define this measure of disadvantage. We then, with this measure of disadvantage and measures and earnings of young adults at age 30, we will estimate measures of social mobility for all local authorities in England and separately for men and women. Once we will have defined these measures of social mobility, we will discuss them. I will present some results about how social mobility varies across England, but also we also try to understand how these measures of social mobility correlate with local characteristics of the areas where these young adults grew up, in particular characteristics of schools and the labor market. Okay, quickly, a quick preview of the results. As I said before, the picture about the UK hides quite a lot of heterogeneity. So we observe a lot of social mobility that varies substantially across local authorities in England. We observed that women exhibit a lower social mobility than men across all local authorities. We also find that by focusing only on stayers, that is, individuals who do not move away from the local authorities where they grew up, we observe worse measures of social mobilities, particularly for individuals from poorer backgrounds. And finally, we observe some very specific patterns in the characteristics of the areas with better social mobility. These areas tend to have lower levels of inactivities and unemployment, smaller manufacturing sector, higher proportion of professional occupations and graduates. And for men, we observe also some correlation between better performing areas in terms of social mobility and quality of school where in the local authorities where they grew up. Okay, so how does this study relate to the existing literature? So this study, in this list of papers, I mostly focus on papers on the UK. I have to mention that a lot of literature on social mobility based on administrative data comes from Scandinavian countries. And the reason is because there is availability of registry data that go back in time and allow linkage to parents. So there is a wide literature based on administrative data from Scandinavian countries. I'll focus here on UK or comparison between UK and Scandinavian countries. So we contribute to the literature on social mobility that has been so far for the UK mostly based on survey data by building on a paper by Carnero and co-authors already published in 2020 that has started to kind of study the geographical differences in across local authorities in England in terms of social mobility. And we build on this paper by adding more cohorts to the analysis, looking at men and women and providing a more comprehensive comparison of these measures across local authorities. We also contribute to the literature on social mobility of women. Again, there is a wide literature based on Scandinavian data. There are some papers on the UK. And here we contribute by providing new estimates and looking at differences across geographical areas. And finally, there is a literature on social and geographical mobility, again, quite sparse for the UK, but we build on studies, in particular on the study by Britton and co-authors that have started to look at how geographical mobility happens across different groups in the population and how that affects earnings. Okay, so as I mentioned before, we do not, the studies usually in social mobility tend to look at associations between child's earnings with parental earnings when the child was younger. However, we do not have this linkage in UK data, which is important to understand how close this relationship is. So we decided to consider our broader measure of disadvantage, a measure of disadvantage that includes the whole neighborhood where the individual grew up, or at least where the individual was observed at age 16. So we build this measure of deprivation based on neighborhood characteristics. And we define in this study neighborhood as output areas, which are a geographical small unit defined by the ONS for the census, for the collection of census data. And the median output area includes around 100 households, I think up to a maximum of around 200 households. So we take the characteristics of these output areas measured by the census 2001, and we aggregate them using principal component analysis. The characteristics of the output area we consider in the analysis are percentage of individuals who own their own home, percentage of individuals in social rented accommodations, percentage of individuals with a college degree, percentage of individuals with no qualification, percentage of individuals with in professional occupations, in elementary occupation. And more importantly, we have a measure of poverty of the neighborhood that is based on the pupil level census data. So from the MPD data set, the data set from the Department for Education that tells us how many children live in the area, what proportion of children live in the area that are eligible for free school meals. So as I said before, we aggregate all these measures with principal component analysis that we define our measure of deprivation. Our empirical strategy is quite simple and is based on the study by Chetty and co-authors published on QJ in 2014. So we estimated the following equation for each local authority A separately for men and women. So in this equation, we have on the left-hand side the earnings percentile rank of individual I within the cohort's national income distribution. And on the right-hand side, we have the deprivation percentile rank of the neighborhood where the individual was observed at age 16. So the parameters of interest for our analysis are the intercept and the slope. So the estimate of the intercept will tell us the expected rank for the individuals at the very bottom of the distribution of the neighborhood ranking. And that's a first measure that is important. We will use in our definition of social mobility. The second important measure is the slope beta. The slope beta tells us the correlation between the neighborhood rank and the earning rank of the individual. However, it's also a measure of, if we want to think it in this way, a measure that defines the difference in terms of earning rankings between individuals, the wealthiest individuals and individuals from most deprived backgrounds. So it's basically a measure of differences in earning ranks. These two measures together will give us, let's say, comprehensive picture of social mobility across different areas in England. So I'll define these measures of mobility a bit more. We will call the slope relative mobility. In particular, when I said, as I mentioned before, when we multiply the slope by 100, we will have the difference in outcome rank between individuals from the wealthiest and individuals from the poorest backgrounds. However, just one thing I would like to mention for when we go to the results. Of course, the higher the beta, the higher will be the correlation between neighborhood rank and earning rank, which means strongest correlations means lower social mobility. So the lower the beta, the better will be the social mobility. I'm just saying this in terms of facilitating the interpretation of the results. However, better relative mobility, that is smaller betas, might be driven by two different things. That could be individuals from wealthier neighborhoods performing worse, or individuals from poorest neighborhood performing better, or a combination of the two. Usually when we study social mobility, we're interested in understanding what happens to individuals in the kind of bottom half of the background deprivation distribution. So for this reason, we will define another measure that is called the absolute mobility. And this measure gives us the expected earnings rank for an individual with a neighborhood rank of 20. In this study, we focus on the neighborhood rank of 20 because it's like a neighborhood, a deprived neighborhood in the bottom half of the distribution of the measure of deprivation. Is not necessarily the poorest, but it can give us an indication when compared consistently across areas of what happens to individuals from poorer backgrounds. Okay, so what are our data sources? As I mentioned already, we use the LEO dataset that combines three main sets of records, information, socio-demographic characteristics, and also information about where individuals lived at age 16 from the National Pupil Database, earnings information from pay and HMRC, and benefit data from a dataset provided by the DWP. Information about the output areas and the characteristics of the output areas to build our measure of deprivation and also see how social mobility correlates with characteristics of the areas come from the 2001 census. Okay, so before going to the results, I just wanted to mention very quickly something about residential mobility, which can help us interpreting the results. And I'm sure Xiaowei, my discussant, will have some comments about this. So what we observe in the data, in the LEO data, is that residential mobility is highly correlated with parental wealth, if we can define the measure of neighborhood deprivation as a kind of as a proxy for parental wealth. So the individuals from wealthiest the wealthier the individual, the wealthier the neighborhood of the individual, the more likely the individual is to not live in the same local authority where he or she were observed at age 16, then again at age 30. So wealthier individuals are more likely to migrate away, and also migration is strongly associated with higher earnings. So of course, these two things together combined can actually affect our definition of social mobility. And in order to better understand how these things kind of interrelate, we focus on, for some of the analysis, on social mobility measures based only on stayers. That is, individuals who never left the areas where they grew up. Individuals that we observe at 30 when they are in the labor market in the same local authority as they were at 16 when they were in school. Okay, so first set of results about relative mobility between men and women. First thing to notice is that there is a wide range of results. If you look at these maps, the yellow areas are areas with better social mobility, and the purple areas are areas with worse social mobility. This is the estimate of the slope in the equation I mentioned before. First thing to notice is that there is a wide range of results for both men and women, and results for women are consistently worse for all local authorities than that of men, and then the results, the estimates of relative social mobility for men. The other thing to notice is that there is quite a lot of geographical variation in these estimates. There isn't a clear pattern. The only clear pattern we observe is that most local authorities in London are yellow, are the best performing. But what happens is that for women, areas around London are actually the worst performing areas. Whereas for men, the purple areas are scattered across the country, mostly Lancashire and the area around Lancashire, and also some areas in the northeast. However, I think the main takeaway from this qualitative look at the first results is that there is a very wide variation in estimates of relative mobility. And this is important if, again, we think about the fact that having a measure at national level actually hides quite a lot of heterogeneity. Here, just a quick look at what are the best the top 10 local authorities for relative mobility for both men and women. All 10 are in London, and they are the same local authorities for men and women for relative mobility. The magnitude of the slopes is different. It's higher for women, therefore lower social mobility for women, but what is quite noticeable is that they are exactly the same local authorities. And then when we look at the bottom local authorities, there isn't a clear pattern. We do observe that for women, there are some areas in London or around London, whereas for men, there are some areas in the north of the country, but there's not a clear pattern. There's not a region that kind of sticks out from these results. What happens in terms of absolute upward mobility? Absolute mobility or absolute upward mobility is the expected rank, the expected earnings rank of individuals in the 20th percentile of the distribution of the neighborhood deprivation. So again, here in these maps, the yellow indicates areas with better upward mobility, and the purple is actually the color for local authorities that perform worse in terms of upward mobility. So again, we see quite a lot of variation. There isn't a clear pattern, if we want, just from a purely qualitative point of view. What is quite noticeable is that most of London performs very well for women. So upward mobility for women is quite high in London and in the areas in the north of London. Whereas this pattern is not that clear for men. Actually, some of the local authorities in London for men are the worst performing in terms of upward mobility, whereas areas around London seem to perform quite well. If we look at the best performing local authorities in terms of upward mobility, we observe some London local authorities for men, but also some other local authorities. And for women, again, they're all London local authorities. When we look at the worst, again, there isn't a clear pattern. For men, mostly in the north of the country, whereas for women, they are scattered between north, east, but also around London, southwest and southeast. Okay, so what about the correlation between genders? We look at here the correlation between relative mobility for men and women and absolute mobility for men and women. What we observe is that the correlation is stronger for relative mobility than for absolute mobility. And again, women tend to have worse social mobility across all areas. This is now this very comes out clearly from this chart. Okay, so what happens when we want to focus on individuals who are who never moved away from the areas where they were observed at age 16, and we compare estimates of social mobility, relative and upward social mobility for those individuals that are stayers to the estimates we've been looking so far. That includes also individuals who moved away from the areas where they were observed at 16. So when we look at the correlation between stayers and the estimates based on the old sample for relative mobility, the first thing that comes out is that nothing changes for London. London is the writing is quite small, but I can tell you that London is the golden dot, and you can see that nothing really changed when we compare when we plot relative mobility for only stayers against relative mobility for the old sample. London, there's not much happening in London. What happens is that we observe better relative mobility for stayers only in all areas that are not London. So once we focus only on stayers, the estimates of relative mobility seems to improve. When instead we look at absolute upward mobility, we have a slightly different picture. And what we observe is that the absolute upward mobility seems to worsen for individuals who never leave, or they are individuals who are observed at age 13, the same local authority as they were at age 16. And the combination of these two results, worse upward mobility and better relative mobility, are mostly driven by the positive selection into migration that I mentioned before. The fact that are mostly wealthier individuals that leave, but also individuals from across the old distribution of deprivation that are more likely to earn higher earnings that leave. So the combination of these two gives a slightly different pictures. Okay, so far we've been looking at how different were these characteristics across areas. And now we look at correlates of spatial variation in relative and upward mobility with characteristics of the areas. These are just simple correlations between local authorities' characteristics and the estimates for men and women for relative and absolute mobility. I'm not going to go into the details, and I realize it's my mistake. I put too many numbers in this slide. But one thing that clearly sticks out is the fact that better labor market seems to be associated with better mobility for both men and women. So we see that mobility is more correlated with higher economic activity, less unemployment, smaller manufacturing sector, and so on. So the labor market and the composition of the labor force in the local authority and the type of labor market seem to be associated to social mobility. Okay, so far we've been considering separately relative and upward mobility. But in a sense, from a policy perspective, it would be interesting to understand what are the areas that perform well in both these measures and those that perform and compare them to the areas that instead perform worse in both of these measures. Because clearly, ideally, we would like both of these measures to be better, to improve across all areas. So what we do here is just we plot, in this chart, relative mobility versus upward mobility, and we focus on those estimates of. We focus on those local authorities that have the best estimates in the sense of estimates of social mobility in the top 25th percentile of the estimates obtained so far, and instead the local authorities that have social mobility in the bottom 25th percentile of the distribution of social mobility. And these areas will be highlighted in the white quadrant in the top left. Those will be the best performing local authorities in terms of both relative and upward mobility. And the worst performing local authorities are the ones in the bottom right white quadrant. Okay, we do this for men and we do this for women. First thing that sticks out here, of course, is that for women, all areas are green, which is the color for London, all areas that perform better. Now, this is an arbitrary way to define better performing versus worse performing areas. However, it's a way that allows us to make a comparison and to see what are the characteristics of areas that seems to be better in both and areas that seems to be worse in both these measures. Okay, so here we look at the characteristics of the areas that perform better and worse in terms of social mobility, including London and excluding London. And the picture is quite similar to what we saw before in the table with lots of numbers. Well, I must say this table has a lot of numbers too. But so the picture is very similar in the sense that areas that perform better are areas with better economic activity, lower unemployment, areas with better labor force composition, with also smaller manufacturing sector, and with more workers with college degree, more workers in professional occupations, and so on. And this is mostly true both, whether we include London or whether we exclude London, and we focus on, we recalculate the 25th bottom and top local authorities by excluding the London local authorities. So the picture seems to be that better social mobility is associated with a better labor market and a better composition of the labor force. Now, one thing to notice, this is the characteristics of better local authorities for men. One thing to notice here is that for men, what seems to matter is also the quality of schools, measured by the average value added. So the value added is a measure that defines the quality of schools for each school aggregated at a local authority level. It seems here that better schools, areas with better social mobility for men are strongly associated with better school quality. When we look at women, the picture is very similar. The quality of the labor market seems to matter the same as for men. both if we consider London or we exclude London. What is interesting here is that when we include London, then the quality of school doesn't seem to matter for women that much. It seems to matter only when we exclude London. Okay, so this study was mostly aimed at giving a descriptive and, if you want, qualitative analysis of social mobility across different areas in England. And we think this is very important because behind the national estimate of social mobility, there is actually a lot of heterogeneity hiding. Heterogeneity across areas and also between groups. This paper focuses on men and women as two separate groups. So what we find is that there is wide variation, spatial variation in social mobility. There are gender differences in social mobility. There is an impact on our estimate of social mobility driven by the selective residential mobility of wealthiest and more able, better performing in the labor market individuals. And then also what we observe is that labor market characteristics and school quality are associated with high social mobility, sorry. And altogether, these characteristics tell us that from a policy perspective, it's important to think about interventions that can target education quality, economic diversification, employment opportunities in areas that are observed as having a very low social mobility. And this could help also reduce the geographical disparity that we observe, not only in geographical mobility, but also in a lot of other outcomes that actually my discussant, Xiaowei Xu, has already described in a very important paper about differences across England. And also another important factor to consider is the gender differences in social mobility. So policies that can address these differences in social mobility, of course, are very important to foster equality of opportunities. Okay, that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Francesca. Xiaowei, we'll hear from your discussion, and then if people have questions, please keep typing them in the Q&A.
Great, thanks very much. Okay. Sorry, that's not right. Let me share another window. Sorry, I don't normally use Teams. There we go. Is that working now?
Perfect. You might want to, yeah, perfect. That's perfect.
Yeah, all right, thanks very much. And thanks for having me. So thanks, Francesca, for that brilliant presentation. So this paper describes differences in relative and absolute mobility across places. I think essentially replicating the approach in Chetty, Hendren, Klein and Saz's QJE paper back in 2014, but using really high quality data from England. I think it tries to extend on that in two ways. First, by documenting differences by gender, and second, by exploring the role of residential mobility in social mobility. So my readings that there's sort of two findings that stand out to me. One, the paper finds high levels of both relative and absolute social mobility in London for both men and women. And two, so my understanding of the findings was that it finds that part of the intergenerational persistence in terms of relative mobility comes from moving, in that outside London, the beta that you estimate is lower for stayers. That is, there's less correlation with family income. So part of that correlation with family income comes from residential mobility, which I think is useful and important to document. So in my discussion, I'm going to focus on the findings on relative mobility, because I think that's where there's more of a contribution. It's more novel in the UK, right? Whereas absolute mobility, I think, essentially reflects area wage premiums, where there's a more established literature. So yeah, I think first of all, it's fantastic that people are using this LEO data to look at mobility, which is something that, as you say, at the local level hasn't been done in the UK because of data constraints. So my main the main thing I was wondering about the paper was on this London effect. So the fact that you seem to find much higher levels of relative mobility in London. I think that's a really interesting finding. And it made me think, you know, is it worth exploring more as to whether this is a causal effect of either living in London or being from London? Or are we picking up the effects of attenuation bias, or perhaps different characteristics of Londoners versus people who live in other parts of the country? So I'll take each of these two in turn. So first of all, in terms of attenuation bias, so of course, due to data constraints in the UK, we can't measure parental income the way Chetty and co-authors do. So instead, you, as you know, people at the IFS have done, as I have done in the past, use this measure, this proxy for socioeconomic status that uses neighborhood level characteristics. And in particular, the socioeconomic status index here is based on principal component analysis of OA level characteristics, which consists of the following set of variables that Francesca has already talked about. And as far as I understand, this is done at the national level so that these factors enter the index in the same way across places. People are assigned an SES index at the national level, and then you sort of look at relative mobility at the local level. And while I was looking at this list, the first two stood out as factors that might not really mean the same thing in London as they do in other parts of the country. And so in particular, in terms of home ownership, for example, we know that house prices in London are much, much, much higher than the rest of the country. Home ownership rates are much lower. And so for a given level of income, home ownership is much less common in London, right? And so I wonder whether home ownership is a sort of a less good proxy for deprivation in London than elsewhere. And sort of even within London, I wonder whether it's sort of a poor proxy for relative deprivation across places, in that, you know, I think just intuitively it seems that it's a lot of places that haven't gentrified where people own their homes. And actually in some fancier places, if you think like, I don't know, like Angel, Clerkenwell, you know, these are places with what anyone would describe as wealthy people, but probably renters. And so I wonder whether this sort of mismeasurement of income coming from this home ownership proxy is leading to attenuation bias. The other thing I wondered about was the use of the percentage of people in social rented accommodation. I think when looking across places, the share of households in social rented accommodation largely reflects, you know, councils' historical decisions to hang on to their social housing stock, or, you know, the current decisions to invest more in social housing rather than, you know, the local levels of deprivation. And again, you see that London has much, much higher rates of socially rented accommodation than other places. So I wonder whether these two things are perhaps causing you to incorrectly classify lots of kids as being deprived in London when they're not actually deprived, and therefore sort of creating attenuation bias and leading to low estimates of intergenerational persistence. So I think that might be something worth exploring. The other thing I was wondering, in terms of reading this as a causal factor, was we know that London has lots more ethnic minorities than other places, and we know that ethnic minorities tend to perform really well academically, given their sort of family income background. So this is just a chart showing, the performance in GCSEs of kids on free school meals in different ethnic groups, and you sort of see that for all ethnic groups, minority ethnic groups, they do better than white British people. And I noted that in your chart with lots of in your table with lots of numbers, you do find a significant correlation between the share of foreign-born people in an area and the relative mobility in the area. So I wonder whether that's also capturing partly the characteristics of the local population, and that's also contributing to the London effect, rather than it being read as a causal chain. I know you don't make any claims on causation, but I think fundamentally what's interesting, right, is whether certain local authorities are better at promoting social mobility. So I think, eventually that's where it would be nice to go. So I guess on that note, I jotted down some sort of possible extensions to explore the London effect, and maybe more generally, I think it would be interesting to see this go in a causal direction. So one thing which perhaps you've already thought of doing is trying to exploit the timing of moves in childhood, like in Chetty and Hendren's QJE paper. Given that in the Leo data, children's and family addresses in different years of their schooling. So that might be interesting. Sort of, a bit more low tech than that, but it would be interesting to see even more correlational analysis that, explores plausible causal mechanisms. So looking at things like the extent of residential segregation in areas, for example, this Facebook thing that Chetty does, looking at sort of social connectedness between socio-economic groups and maybe measures of social capital that could speak to, why it is that certain areas have higher levels of relative mobility than others. So you do correlational analysis at the moment, of course, but I do wonder whether a lot of the effects right now are just driven by London. So in particular, the correlation with the share of professional jobs. I mean, that could easily just be, London has lots of professional jobs. London seems to have extremely high relative mobility on your measure. So yeah, so sort of looking at causal mechanisms, I think would be a really interesting extension. Completely unrelated to causal mechanisms, I would also be intrigued to see a bit more about gender and more about how you interpret the differences by gender. So you do show that your relative mobility estimates are very correlated for men and women, but there are some places that stand out, and I wonder, what explains why relative mobility might be higher in some places for men rather than women. And in particular, I wondered whether you exclude zeros in your analysis, whether you just focus on earnings for people in work, in which case, could this be driven by differential selection of women into the labour market in some places? Yeah, I think that's all from me. Thanks very much. That was a really interesting presentation.
Well, thank you, Xiaowei. Lots of useful comments and questions there. And we also have quite a few questions in the Q&A box. But before we go to those, Francesca, do you want to just provide some response to Xiaowei's comments?
Yes, thank you, Xiaowei. Thank you so much, as always. So I think all your comments, most of them, I agree with them. I think one point of let's start from the measure of deprivation. I think originally the main starting point was to make these estimates comparable to the original study. There was a report for the Social Commission. But I agree with you that there is some work that can be done to actually refine this measure, and particular to try to understand whether, as you mentioned, London sticks out because of its characteristics of the output areas, the particular characteristics of the output areas that we are using to define these measures. So we can do more work on that. I agree. I'm not sure whether in this paper or maybe in a next paper there can be completely focus on that, because I think the problem is that the Leo data are brilliant and can be used in a lot of ways, but we do need to find a measure of parental wealth. We need to define it, and we need to even have some, I don't know, but like upper bounds on what we can say about parental deprivation. So I think that could be for another paper, experimenting on the measure. I totally agree with you. Your comments were all on point. I didn't have much else to say about that. Just to all your suggestions as well on future studies are great. I think some of that will be part of our future work together or separately, but you know, the idea is going towards understanding how exposure, length of exposure to a certain areas affect later life outcomes for young adults. So that's one thing. The other thing is about gender differences. One thing I forgot to mention when I was discussing the results is the fact that the ranking of earnings is done at national level by cohort, but not by gender. So in the case of upward mobility, we do observe lower mobility mechanically because women tend to earn less than men, so they're more concentrated in the bottom part of the earning distribution. So that is one thing. It was more about looking at correlation between areas. One further analysis could be doing this ranking at separately for genders and see if something changes in terms of the results. I doubt something would change in terms of relative mobility, because that is just a correlation between neighborhood ranking that is done anyway, and not by gender, but by cohort and earning ranking. So that I doubt, and I agree with you. More has to be done to try to understand why women seem to perform worse than men. But for upward mobility, we do know that there is a kind of mechanical explanation to that. So I should have mentioned it. Thank you for highlighting it.
Okay, well, thank you. We've got quite a few questions. So I'm going to ask people who have posted questions to unmute their mics and join us. First of all, if Georgie Vasiliev from the ONS is still here, you posed quite a few questions, including whether Francesca and possibly Xiaowei have a wish list for ONS about improvements to data that would help this analysis. Georgie, are you available? Perhaps not. In any case, do you have? I mean, I think Francesca, you've already mentioned some of the data wishes, but are there other things that you could that the ONS could help with to improve this type of analysis? You're muted, Francesca.
Sorry. For these type of analysis in particular, like because we follow the work of Chetty, in a sense, we don't do anything different from that. What we have is enough. What we would like is parental income. That would be amazing. And if the ONS found a way to link that to the Leo data, would make a lot of researchers happy. But more generally, to understand the drivers of social mobility, what we would like is better linkage to employers. Try to understand. So the Leo data already includes information about employers, but we would like more specific information about where the employer is, the turnout of the employer, information, all of the possible information that are available to the ONS about the employer. That will make, because the thing is, there are two components of social mobility. One is the environment the young adult is exposed to while growing up, but the second component is the local labor market that is available to the young adult once they finish school or university. And as I said, there is a positive selection into moving away from areas that maybe don't have the best local labor markets for individuals who can afford to move away, or they have better abilities to earn. But there is a big proportion of individuals who can't move away. And so improving, understanding the characteristics of the labor market and the employers around the young adults would be very important. I'm sure Xiaowei has something to add to that.
She may do, but she's disappeared from my screen. So let's move on. Michaela Vecchi, do you want to join us? And you have some questions which actually relate to some of the points that Xiaowei raised. I'm doing very well on unmuting here. So, well, anyway, Michaela asked whether is interested in exploring ethnic differences in these differences by ethnicity. And I mean, I know this is part of a wider project. Is that something you plan to look at?
No. I think I can't talk for my co-authors, but I think some of my co-authors are going in that direction. But I think it would be very interesting because, of course, there are very big differences in performance of different ethnicities in school. And so we would expect also differences in their trajectory, earning trajectories over time. Sorry, Xiaowei, I was just saying, I don't know if you can hear me. I was saying, I'm sure you have something to add about the wish list for the ONS.
Sorry, I dropped out. I don't think I do, actually. That was a very comprehensive wish list. That sounds good. Obviously, having Leo data in the same project folder, the same project as other data sets would be very useful rather than transferring things across. But yeah, I think that was a good comprehensive list.
And we also have a question from Stephen Redpath, who says that there's been a policy in recent years of moving job seekers out of London and whether that would have an impact on social mobility, what your thoughts are around that.
Yes, no, definitely. I think we need to understand who are the individuals who take these jobs, first of all, and whether moving these jobs also changes the local economy in the areas where these jobs are moved, or whether just the people from cities just moving. I don't know, I'm thinking about all the public sector that has moved big offices to the north of England or to Wales. I think we need to, I haven't done any study on that, but I think this is interesting and it could be, it could be something that could be studied, understanding what's the impact for social mobility for individuals who lived in that area, whether they take the job or not, whether moving these jobs improve the local economy in those areas. Yes, it's definitely something that can be researched. I think there is some study on the BBC, the effect of moving the BBC to Manchester, that found some positive effect for the local economy. We can expect some spillover on social mobility, possibly. I don't know, Xiaowei, I'm sure you are more informed than me on this.
I mean, I think that's one reason why it would be really valuable, I think, to try to establish a causal mechanism in your paper, in your research, because if we can say that there's something that actually goes from there being a high concentration of professional jobs in London to there being more relative social mobility, which I think, that's a plausible causal pathway, right? If we can establish that, then we can say that in moving professional jobs to other places would also improve social mobility in those places.
Yes, I agree.
A question from Michael Nolan, which I think the nub of it is, of course, Leo is only going back so far, so you have a limited set of cohorts to look at. And does that have any bearing on your results, do you think? I mean, we have, of course, changing circumstances for different cohorts over time. And what do you think that would mean for your analysis?
Well, in my analysis, I don't aim to look at any trend in social mobility. Of course, in order look at what happens over time, we need a much longer period of time. This is what a lot of studies based on Swedish data do. They can go back in time to the 50s, 60s, and they can look at how social mobility has evolved between men and women over time. So we can't do that. I have to say there are some studies based on survey data and the birth cohort studies on social mobility over time that show that social mobility has got worse. And at least by the time the cohort was born born in 1990. I think it was the next step cohort, still hadn't recovered from this dip. So there is some data sources out there that allow us to see a kind of pattern, the trend over time. But unfortunately, Leo data, we need to wait for the next 20 or 30 years to produce some interesting trends.
Yeah, I think there's a paper
Xiao.
by Steve Machen. I'm struggling to remember the findings now, but they use the longitudinal study, which is the linked census data,
yes,
to look at occupational mobility. Obviously, there's no income data there, but yeah, that's something that's looked at that.
Yes, it's an alternative source of data rather than the Leo. Leo allows us to do certain things, but if we want to, Xiaowei is right, if we want to look at a longer period of time, there is the longitudinal data, the ONS longitudinal data set. Yeah, and the Machen's paper.
Okay. Well, I think we're on time now. And sorry to those whose questions we haven't been able to ask. I'm also seeing apparently we're supposed to unmute, so apologies for not having managed to do that. In any case, thank you very much, everyone, for your questions and for participation today. And thank you, of course, to Francesca for an excellent talk and for all this work, and also Xiaowei for your comments and discussion. And I hope to see everybody in the new year when our next webinar series kicks off on January the 16th. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Francesca.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.